And hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of the Underground. We are a university and charity founded in 2017 in the basement of a nightclub in Amsterdam. We offer free education, and I am Naum, the head of program of I Want to Believe, which is a program that investigates religion and belief systems as a part of a 3-month residency. I would like to welcome our researchers and participants, and also to the visiting participants. So if you are watching this, I would appreciate a lot if you could go to our website and donate something, whatever you can, so we can keep doing these programs. The talk is going to be 40 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. And today we have with us Malena Arcucci. Malena was born in and raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Malena is a performance maker, currently based in London, and she uses devised and physical theater techniques in combination with her background and interest in costume making and sculpture to explore new forms of storytelling. In 2019, Malena completed a Master in Design of Experiences at the University of the Underground, so she's part of our familia. Then she collaborated with in various projects and institutions like the British Transport Police, the Dutch National Opera House in Amsterdam, and Teatro in Argentina. In 2016, she founded Mariana Malena with Mariana Aristizabal, a plurinational theater company that engages in practical research regarding the concepts of adaptation, womanhood, and repatriation. So I think Malena's knowledge of the University of the Underground and her experience of being a student are going to be very valuable for today's lecture. So Malena, all yours.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I am a former student of the University of the Underground. As Naum said, I was on the Master Design of Experiences in Amsterdam between 2017 and 2019. And I was then also a tutor in some of the research programs. And I thought, well, I proposed to Nelly to do this workshop because even like in my course, there's always been like a bit of resistance towards kind of like actually contacting and reaching out to the institutions, different collaborators and communities. I think there's kind of like this fear, which I fully understand because I experienced it, or this misconception that we need to contact them once we have like our project fully finalized. And it's kind of like it took me a while I was at the university, but I kind of like realized that they are not meant to be kind of like passive observers of what you're doing, but rather kind of like shape your research and inform it. And for that to happen, it's good to reach out sooner rather than later. So I proposed to Nelly to do kind of like a couple of encounters. I think we have today and one in a couple of weeks, and then another one where we actually send emails and messages. I'm not going to talk that much. I mean, I'm going to kind of like talk about my practice and the projects that I've done, but just as examples of the ways in which I reached out to institutions and managed to get them on board. But today, what I would like us to do is kind of like by the end of the day, to all of us have sent like a minimum of 3 emails or messages. So it's going to be like, if you're on your laptop, that's great. If you're not, then I would say like it's a good time to get on your laptop. But I think it's also a day where, and I needed this during my time at the University of the Underground, where you kind of like support each other in sometimes that can be, in something that can sometimes be a little bit daunting, which is kind of like getting your ideas out there even before they're fully shaped. So I think it would be nice to kind of like at the end of the session today, just hit send all together. Just kind of like support each other, give each other a clap and a tap in the back, and then get it over with. And then hopefully in the sessions to come, in a couple of weeks time, we are going to be able to kind of like do the whole thing of follow-up and kind of like planning for meetings and planning for actually engaging or going to these institutions or sharing with them what you've finally done. So as Naum said, I am many things. I think at one point over the years, I decided to call myself a storyteller because it's a little bit what encompasses like all of the different projects that I have going on. On the one hand, I am a theater maker. Actually, these black drapes, I am sitting in a gorgeous rehearsal space in Southeast London where I'm based because we're doing R&D for a show. I do a lot of theater design, so sets and costume design, costume supervision. I've done it for like fringe theater, but also for bigger productions like the Phantom of the Opera. So kind of like I do whatever I'm asked to do. I am a documentary producer. I am a tarot reader. I am a dramaturg. I am a seamstress. So kind of like I choose, or I think I am lucky enough to be able to choose projects rather than kind of like job titles. But I think in general, the reason why I call myself a storyteller is that I am kind of interested in that in-between space between fiction and reality, right? Like the fictions that we collectively tell each other that then through time become our reality and shape our societal and political structures. And I'm fascinated by the possibility of using theater and performance and imagery to kind of like explore that theatricality or make it evident, and in order to help us kind of like rethink our daily existence. Does that make sense so far? I don't know if I'm talking like yeah, okay. So I kind of like really do want to make sure that we write today. So I know that you had a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, um, like a workshop with Alex and Lauren about choosing an institution. Not yes or no?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
good. That's great because I think like it would be nice to kind of like pick up on what you did then to work today. I am so I'm gonna share a little bit like how I approach animal writing, and then we'll go into actually writing or examples. So wait, so is there? Yes. So the first, can I share my screen? No, yeah,
One sec.
no
Let
worries.
me. Now you should be able to do it.
Cool. So can you see it? It's just a Google Docs. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. So the first thing, of course, I do is to think about like who I'm gonna send that email to, and by this I don't mean the institutions. You've hopefully like figured out roughly who you want to work with. But I think it is important to understand that there's like, and I'm going to repeat this over and over again, you need to be like super strategic in terms of who you contact. So why would you contact the CEO or a kind of like lower ranking employee or a manager? A lot of times what I like to do is to initially contact the communications officers and the PR department. In 2018, I did I can show you, I did a project called A Kilogram of Feathers in collaboration with Joseph Please, where we created a mini opera. Uh, every time I do doesn't want to let me go to the next slide, but I'll manage at some point. Anyways, we created a mini opera to deal with collective trauma of an institution. In that particular case, we worked with the International Criminal Court that is based in The Hague. And the trauma that we work with is the fact that, the International Criminal Court has not been able to get acknowledgement from some of the biggest nations in the world, and therefore they have no jurisdiction in those nations. So what we did, because we had been trying to get in touch with the judges and the lawyers. Initially, we just emailed the communications officers and PR department, and we understood first how they want to be perceived and how they want to be heard by others. And then through them, we managed to get the emails and the kind of like contact details for the judges and the lawyers. It is quite helpful to work with somebody in the periphery. So instead of working with somebody that works directly with the institution, maybe like former members that are able to tell you how things work or give you contacts. So again, in terms of that project with the ICC, at one point we contacted a former member that we found through LinkedIn. So we knew that this person, he was a lawyer, he had helped set up the institution, and he was the one who managed to get us in. Another option is contacting maybe a customer, a user, somebody who experiences the institution, and then through them understand how they work. I don't know if you're familiar, but Luke Rideout and Jack Wackhorn, two of my classmates at the University of the Underground, actually became the Deliveroo drivers and participated in their activities as a way to actually then go back to the Deliveroo, and it was the same project, so they were also creating an opera. But they were kind of like, I think this makes sense, right? But it's kind of like, it's somebody who experiences that system rather than the system itself. Now for the kind of like the trickiest part tends to be finding the contacts. Sometimes it's quite straightforward, which I hope is going to be the case today. So you basically say, we want to go to the New Zealand Geospatial Research Institute. I just chose whatever. You go to people, to the about, and you have the names of everybody who works there. I suggest doing a little bit of research in terms so you don't go kind of like blindly. I chose randomly this time, but don't do that, a man called Lucas. And then I Google him, and that's his email. And then everybody who works at Canterbury University in New Zealand will have an email address that is like name dot last name at canterbury.ac.nz. So therefore you have like all of these emails. It happens quite often, and this is how I kind of like most of the time get email addresses. The second one is nepotism and proximity. This is a little bit like sad, but it's also true. I'm not sure how many of you there are now, but I'm guessing around 15. And in total, I think the students of the University of the Underground from the beginning till now is somewhere around 60 or 80 maybe, plus the advisory board member, plus your friends, your family, friends of friends. Somebody in your proximity will absolutely, definitely know somebody who can help you in this situation. So something that I'm also going to say many times today is kind of like talk about your projects. So many times I was kind of like stuck and getting no responses, and it turned out that the most random friends of friends knew somebody who could help me and was willing to give me an email address. So yes, an example of that is, for example, I ended up I was working on a project. I wanted to kind of like tell the news in Argentina, because Argentina is in deep, or was at that time, but still is in deep economical crisis. And I wanted to tell kind of like the news in the form of ASMR. Do you know what ASMR is? Yeah, cool. So I ended up contacting the Argentine's president's right-hand man, a person who had also advised the president to go to speaking and oration workshops. And the way I did that was my father, who's a journalist, sent me, gave me the contact of another journalist, who in turn said like, oh, that sounds like a fun project. Let me give you someone's email. And at one point I was sending kind of like WhatsApp audios with the Argentina's president's kind of like aid. So yeah, somebody definitely knows somebody else. Assistants and employees are very helpful, as well as I think sometimes you kind of like get stuck with the big names. But I think it's a lot more valuable to have the kind of like perspective or input of somebody who has perspective, and people to be able to do that kind of like the people who are able to do that are usually kind of like assistants or lower ranking employees, and they get some distance and they're still able to kind of like understand dynamics. So, for example, from the British Transport Police, I worked with the British Transport Police to create a project called "Sitting is Not a Problem," where we kind of like analyze the irrelevant footage in security cameras in London's underground. And it was actually Jack Waghorns, another one of my classmates' brother-in-law, who happened to be a police officer, and he got me in touch with somebody who could kind of like get me into the control room. And then again, social media platforms is very helpful, particularly I find it to find communities like Reddit, Facebook, Instagram. People tend to vie to places where they can create communities. And then I think once you manage to kind of like reach the communities that are related to your topic and to your institution, then you get a much deeper and kind of like interesting projects. Um, I'll go into conspiracy theories later. And then in person, I actually did that quite a lot of times when I was tight on time while I was in university. So we had only a couple of months, and I knew for a fact that I wasn't going to be able to kind of like arrange for a coffee and then do the whole kind of like chat and then another chat and another chat until I dare to ask um, to go like to film them or record them. So I attended like a bunch of conferences, and then you go and speak to the people. I know in times of COVID this is not necessarily kind of like possible, but at the same time there's so many things happening online and so many people talking and speaking online. And then they're kind of like just there, they're on the same Zoom call or Google Meets or whatever it is. In this particular case, at some point I'm going to talk about my trip to Finland in a bit, but I did a project called Conspiratorial Mythologies. I don't know why I cannot open that one. And about conspiracy theories. So that was my graduation project. I likened conspiracy theories to religious and mythological narratives. And what I mean by that is that they are fictions that allow us to fill the gaps within, like in our understanding of the world, and in turn also mirror our systems of belief, right? So kind of like the way in which we understand political, social, and social agents. So way at the beginning, I started working on a particular conspiracy theory about Finland not being a real country. So there being no landmass where Finland is located. And I became quite obsessed about like actually proving to them that Finland is there. So I went to Finland and I worked with the Geospatial Research Institute there. I later on realized that there's kind of like no proving that Finland is there. I mean, it's like, it's not the point, but never mind. But I really wanted to go to Nokia, and I tried everything. I did like, you know, friends of friends, everything, all of the above that I've told you, and I couldn't actually, like, they were not like really open. So once I got to Finland, I heard that there was like an innovation awards happening in their headquarters. So if you imagine, it's a little bit like Silicon Valley, where you have like a bunch of buildings. And so I signed up to attend these innovation awards, and then just walked in. Um, and then I kind of like walked around Nokia. This might not be the case at the time, but kind of like it's a possibility, and it's quite effective as well. And I think all of this then boils down to kind of like choosing the way in which you are gonna approach these people. As I said before, it's kind of like it's about being like not overthinking it, but being like really strategic in terms of the ways in which you present yourself. A lot of times, I won't say I'm a storyteller, as I told you today, but I'm rather going to say I am an artistic researcher, and that gives me a little bit of like wiggle room. It's broad enough that they won't ask me exactly what it is that I'm doing and why I want to talk to them, but specific enough that they're not surprised when I finally say I am a theater maker or I want to do like whatever it is I was doing at the time. Sometimes, and I miss this quite a lot, being a student is extremely helpful. It opens a lot of doors. I think you say, like, I'm a student, and doors go like boom, boom, boom. People are willing to talk to somebody who's in the process of learning. And then once it's over, it's over. So I would say kind of like make the most out of it while you can. You can be both an artistic researcher and a student. I think in certain situations it helps to say you are an artist, a poet, a designer. Um, but I find it that in like within, particularly if you're going for an institution that is quite corporate, it's a little bit scary, and that's what I mean with strategic. But we'll see kind of like specific examples. Um, okay, study the language of the institution. This is quite straightforward, and I'm guessing like I don't even need to say this, but just in case, kind of like if the language of the institution is formal, just kind of like or colloquial, um, or if they speak with acronyms, or if it's academic. And then I think there's two ways to go around it. You can either be kind of like confrontational, and I'm sure you saw this with Alex and with Lauren, right? Like you don't need to choose institutions that you agree with. And I think there's something like quite smart, for example, to like writing to sending poems to kind of like a Google executive. But it needs to be like a conscious decision. And then in studying the language, I think in times of kind of like political and social unrest, it is also very important to kind of like make it clear where you stand and build bridges. So, for example, I will sometimes kind of like sign if I do a lot of things in the Basque Country, and I know that they're kind of like very loving of their language rather than Spanish, which is my mother tongue. So I make sure I will sign Escarrik Asko, and kind of like, build like throw that line and say like, hey, I'm here, I understand. So I don't know if that made sense. I can only see a couple of you. But okay, again, as I said, with the Argentinian president's right hand man, I started sending like very formal texts over WhatsApp, but like very formal. And at one point, I realized like the guy was just sending audios, and it was easier for him to do it like that. And he had no kind of like expectations of me talking to him in any other way. So I just kind of like changed my mood slightly. In Reddit groups is very important if you're going to go for communities on Facebook and online. I think there's kind of like a bit of like being a bit of a chameleon and just knowing when you just need to be friendly and when you need to be um, pretend to be clever. In my case, pretend. Okay, and then beware of the information that you provide. That one I learned kind of like the hard way. At the University of the Underground, I think you'll realize once you finish the course, but people are both like very attracted to the name and very freaked out by it. So it kind of like comes up in every single job application I have. It's like, what is the University of the Underground? What do you do? Is kind of like a real thing. I think in our course in particular, they had like this idea of like anarchy and disaster, maybe kind of like that's not the case anymore. And I hope it's not, because I don't think it's necessarily about that way of doing things. So for the British Transport Police, I would rarely say I was the University of the Underground, just because it's just kind of like it kind of like created an immediate barrier. I would either go around it or use acronyms to just say kind of like you on emails, or and then thinking outside the box, which I think is the nicest thing. One of my classmates, John Breaker, for example, he managed to get somebody to lend him a living room to project a movie by standing in the middle of the street with a sign saying like, "Can I use your living room?" I visited the European Parliament and wrote little haikus for Nigel Farage. Do you know who Nigel Farage is? And I left him when you get into the European Parliament, like in the inside, the day-to-day things, like you have all of these mailboxes for day-to-day operations. And I saw Nigel Farage's, and I was kind of like waiting around in between things. and I kind of like really wanted to do something. So I started writing haikus about how he's a racist and a horrible person, and then would go and kind of like put them inside. It was not like a finished action. It was just kind of like a way of, I don't know, getting it out of my system and reaching out. But I think there's something about kind of like, as I said before, particularly if it's an institution that you don't fully agree, to kind of like working around it and seeing how you can show yourself, all of you, right? So it can be like drawings, maybe you want to send a song, or I think in the last cohort, Tracy sent a bunch of like blank emails as a way to talk about like women of color being silenced in corporate scenarios. So I think there's something about kind of like, yeah, understanding how to write an email, but then looking for different ways. And I think in itself, and that's why I always rather write the email, in a way, not receiving an answer might be just as strong as receiving one, and understanding why you didn't get it and how you kind of like shook somebody hard enough that they couldn't even bring themselves to say like, I'm not interested by. Does that make sense? No? Yeah. Okay. And then I think it's important that like you're very, very clear in terms of like what you want. So I would say, kind of like, if you picture yourself in that situation, you receive a lot of emails a day. If you receive a very long one, chances are you might either leave it for later or kind of like just scan through it and not watch it. So as a first initial email, I would say keep it super clear and concise. So kind of like 2 sentences about what you do. Very kind of like, make sure that you done enough research to understand what it is that might interest the other person about your work. So I think it needs to go both ways. And in that sense, I think it's always helpful to mention like what you've read or what you've seen or where you got their details, and just make sure that they understand it. I did, for the same conspiratorial mythologies aside, I ended up kind of like turning conspiracy theories into Greek tragedies, to kind of like try and find new ways of disseminating them. But aside, I also created this narrative object. So in the same line of Greek culture and mythology, I created amphoras and vases that contained like flat earther narratives and anti-vaxxers and but to do that, I wanted to be I wanted one of my bases to be in the Rijksmuseum of Antiquities. And I think that was something that I learned later on that I shouldn't, I should have approached differently. Basically, I approached the director and I asked him for a meeting, and he was extremely kind. He gave me like 3 hours, showed me the whole of the museum. But then, of course, after he had done that, he was busy, and he was like, "Okay, cool. Like now, you've been here. Now go along and do your own thing." And so I missed the opportunity of merging everything in once and planning my visit properly. So what I'm saying is, like, sometimes you just have like that one chance, so you need to think about how you're gonna do it. I would always say, kind of like, don't ask for space or time or help without offering anything in return. I think it's fine when you kind of like propose to have a discussion, but when you go straight into asking something out of people, particularly if you're gonna ask space for workshops, I don't know, venues in London tell me that they receive like tons of emails about that all of the time. So unless you're sure that you can give something in return, I would say like probably don't. State a timeline clearly. I think it's much more likely that somebody's going to reply positively if you just say like, how is a week of the 30th looking for you? And then you just kind of like put it in time and say, I can be flexible, but this is when I want to meet. And just be clear with what you want. Do you want to do an interview? Do you want to have an informal chat? Do you want somebody else's contact number, or to film, to take pictures, or to visit the building? So I think those are the elements that I kind of like try to keep in mind. And then I think that in like 20 minutes, we can write 3 emails each together and send them. I hope this makes sense. I rushed through it, but because it's not about me today. So would you mind, maybe one of you, telling me if you've managed to, if you have an institution that you are kind of like interested in reaching out to, and you haven't already, or maybe if you have already started? Has anybody sent an email?
Yeah, Jessica has.
Jessica. Cool. Who did you contact, Jessica?
I reached out to the Judson Memorial Church.
Mhm. In the US.
Yeah, in New York.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm only half vaccinated, so I
Okay.
didn't try to go down there. But I just reached out through Instagram. I'm a career pornographer, so that opens a lot of doors for me.
Mm.
Just like, hello, doing this little 3-month program on belief, really interested in the spirituality of sex workers. What can I learn about your outreach to prostitutes in the 70th
Mm.
Street?
Okay.
Um, and they were like, yeah, great, sweet. Here are 3 people we're going to pass your contact info on. And I haven't heard back, but one of those people I know through other circles, and I have her email address. So I could reach out to her today. Um,
Cool. That's and do you have a plan as to how you're gonna approach that? You're good.
uh, no, because I don't know what I will do for the project.
Mm.
I know what my subject is. I've got a survey that I'm circulating through like various like the producers organization and like whatever influence. But I don't, you know I don't know what I'm doing yet. I'm just sort of like gathering information.
Yeah, um, I think I forgot, but I think that's the most kind of like common feeling, or at least the one I had when I was in class. It's kind of like, one more week and I'll figure out what it is that I'm doing, and I'll get in touch. Or one more week and kind of like I'll do it next month or closer to the kind of like handing date. But I think the whole experience for me of going to Finland, even and I think I want to emphasize the fact that it ended up being like it didn't quite make it to my project, because I ended up realizing like maybe like 2 weeks before going into Finland, after I had booked everything, that they, just because conspiracy theories work like religious narratives, it doesn't make any sense to say like to tell someone like what you believe is wrong. Like that was not my place, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Finland exists or it doesn't. It's kind of like the outer layer of a whole set of narratives that are on top of each other, and that kind of like boil down to being extremely afraid of not knowing, of having no answers, right? Or of being like deceived, and a deep discontent towards um, mm, uh, democracy. So for a second I forgot what democracy was. I was like, that thing where you vote. I'm sorry. But that experience was amazing because it kind of like incorporated all of these things that I've listed today. I started kind of like going straight for the Ministry of Agriculture of Finland, right? Like that was the person, his secretary is the one that I was emailing, and of course I was getting no response. I mean, like she was saying, I don't see how this is of interest. We are not interested in conspiracy theories. So I was a little bit frustrated, but I already had a ticket to go to Finland. So I was talking to a friend who said, like, I have a friend who's Finnish and she might help. She recommended I go through a cultural kind of like platform for artists in Finland they didn't respond for a bit. And then at one point, I mentioned that I was working in collaboration with my boyfriend and his business partner, and they have a very nice and kind of like swanky website. And I think that goes back to how you present yourself. So as soon as I sent an email and said like, hey, they are on board, or kind of like I'm collaborating with them, little white lie or kind of like omission of some sort, I got a response, and they were like, oh, you should try the Geospatial Research Institute. And within that, I got like, I hit a couple of roadblocks where they were saying like, we don't understand the scope of your research, or it doesn't like quite make any sense. And eventually kind of like they gave me the name of a person who was like, yeah, kind of like, it sounds good. And then I have footage of them because I was filming while I was there, and I got it translated, and they were talking in Finnish and saying like, I don't know what this woman is doing here, like I don't know what she wants to do. But I was like super happy filming and kind of like doing LiDAR and radar technologies and learning about kind of like 3D modeling of topographical surfaces. It was amazing. So I think there is kind of like, kind of like trying is the best way of realizing whether or not it's gonna work. But again, enough about me. Is there anyone else who has an institution and they're not like quite sure how to reach out, or anybody who's willing to be a case study so we can all kind of like strategize together?
I it's not really the institution that I want to work with, but just as part of the research, I emailed a video game developer and did an interview with him yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah. But maybe it's not useful because it's not the institution I want to work with, but it was more just to collect research on the topic because I'm still quite stuck on the institution. But I mean, I guess I was still contacted someone and got someone's time that they kindly gave me.
Yeah. So you're not sure which institution you want to contact?
Yeah, I wanted to ask actually because you seem like when you're just really like, oh, and then I contacted them and them and them, and I wondered how you like decide to like how did you know that you want to work with the British Transport Police, or yeah, so I wanted to ask this about choosing them in the first place.
Okay. I um I think it's a little bit like partly it's trial and error. I don't know if that's like very helpful. I usually start with I think what you did is quite helpful. Is like you start with somebody who's doing research, like or in academia, and they maybe are able to kind of like help you understand the scope of how many other organizations are working in your area of interest. What's your topic?
My topic is the kind of visual representation. I mean, I completely changed topics since last week, but now it's the visual representation of supernatural and ghosts in mostly secularized communities.
Okay. Okay. Is I'm not familiar with like all of your topics, so it's kind of like hard to think from the top of your head. But my advice is kind of like what I wanted us to do today is like the institution that you contact today doesn't need to be the final one. So if there is any kind of like articles that you read where someone is mentioned, or kind of like the most obvious one, is there an illustrator that is working on that, or a I don't know, somebody that is like fully against it. I think that's the people that you go for. And then, as I said at the beginning, is like the important bit about contacting them today, or kind of like now, is that then they will inform the way in which you kind of like finally decide on your institutions. So I don't think I ever contacted, like the first institution I contacted was never the one that I ended up kind of like using.
Okay.
The International Criminal Court came out of the fact that I'm Argentinian and I was working in collaboration with a classmate who's British, and we were talking about kind of like as a collective trauma, we were talking about the Falklands, and we we're kind of like doing just reading and researching the Falklands, and we realized that it has never been declared a war, but rather an armed conflict. And that led us to kind of like an organization that works. There's an organization that kind of like fights for armed conflicts to be turned into wars, because then people can be prosecuted, right? Like responsible people. That then led us to the International Criminal Courts and to a completely different trauma. We never spoke about the Falklands again. So do you see what I mean? There's kind of like a progression at some point, but I think it's, yeah, if it happens in your head, it's much harder to explain it to someone else, or to kind of like turning into a project.
Yeah, and that kind of links to the question. I wrote a question in the chat while you were speaking, and it connects to what you're saying about contacting lots of different institutions, and lots of them just kind of being for collecting bits of research and stuff. And I wrote, how can we show that we can give the institution something in return when at the beginning we are not even sure what the project is yet?
Okay. I think for some institutions, I think just kind of like having the research used in other scenarios or mentioned in an academic setting might be beneficial. So, for example, with the conspiracy theories, at one point, there's a lot of like alternative scientific organizations. So basically, they think about like new forms of physics or geometry that would kind of like then justify flat Earth, just to kind of like in a nutshell. And I contacted them, and they were very prompt to reply, because they want their research mentioned within other academic settings. So that's one option. The other option is, I don't think you always need to give something in return, as long as what, depending on what you're asking. And that's why I mean, kind of like when you go for space and help from another person, or kind of like you ask to record them, I think that's a lot more to ask than to have an initial cup of coffee, or kind of like an email back and some information on what they're doing and who they're working with. And then I think you can also kind of like I think recognition and credit at the end of your project is also a way of giving people back, or kind of like the promise that as soon as you finish your project, you're going to recognize that you have been helped and by another person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I do have one more question, but maybe if someone
Go for
else.
it.
Okay. We also, with our course, and probably with your one, that with we need to make sure that like our project isn't just kind of an artistic project for ourselves, and is kind of having even just a small impact with the institution that we work with. And I just wondered how you navigated that. For example, you gave the example of the Geo institution in Finland, and the people were saying, what is this woman doing here? Or like when you worked with the British Transport Police, did you feel like what your project did have any sort of, it's really hard to navigate that, I feel.
Yeah. I think I always thought it about like two different things, right? Like the one thing is the institution, and another completely different thing is the community that you seek to kind of like influence, or I would never use the word help, but I think what you do is just provide a different perspective or point of view on any given topic. So I never kind of like considered that I was helping per se, if you know what I mean. I was just kind of like proposing like, oh, maybe you can look at it like this, and using like theater and design to do that. So in terms of the to be honest, the Geospatial Research Institute, they seemed like they were having a good time as well. Aside from the fact that they were kind of like wondering what I was doing there, they got to show me like all of their research, and all of it's like a very much like technology based institution. So like all of the new developments in terms of mapping and three-dimensional mapping, we were laughing. I got them lunch for like the 3 days that I was there, and then we went for beers with the people that were working there. So I think it was more like they were quite curious about how I was ever going to use what I was talking about there within my research. And I think it just helped me, like for me, the only question that it answered was like, no, I cannot actually prove that Finland exists, like, because it doesn't matter. So whatever, like, yeah, like it's there. I don't know, I saw it. That's all I can tell you. And I believe it is there. I think that's it. In terms of the British Transport Police, I don't think I gave enough back on that project, if I'm honest. I mean, I managed to get there, and I think I was a little bit over my head. But I don't regret doing it. I kind of like learned from that experience, and you prepare yourself better the next time.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So
I
yeah.
have one more question. It's kind of quick, but you
Yeah.
mentioned contacting people in person. So, and I was just wondering, when you do that, if you just kind of like start asking a lot of questions and like talking, and then like a while after you're already talking with the person, you say like, "Oh yeah, and by the way, I'm an artist researcher," or you just like present yourself as that.
It varies. It again, it's, I think doing it in person is the same way as doing it over email. I think you need to kind of like be like, do the research before, so know who you're talking to, so you're not caught off guard. So you kind of like go prepared, and you need to the same way as an English or as an email, sorry, kind of like check what kind of language you're going to use. So if it's like here, it's very common, like for example, after the theater, everybody's hanging out, or after an exhibition. So you kind of like see people that you want to work with, or you would like to collaborate with, or kind of like whose work is interesting. I mean, you approach them at the first, like the first time, just kind of like introduce yourself normally, and then I think it's kind of like finding slowly a way to introduce what it is that you're working on. And sometimes it's just a matter of saying like, you know, I am working on kind of like spectrum and ghost representations or iconography within secular environments. Did I say that right, Chloe? No, I murdered it. Okay, good. This is what I'm doing. But then I think in that case, I would kind of like turn it into something is a little bit more kind of like down to earth. So I'm fascinated by kind of like the representation of ghosts and non-earthly creatures. And then it becomes something that we can talk about, because somebody can tell you like, oh, yeah, I kind of like lab ghosts, or I prefer Casper to the other guy. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's just then having a little bit of like waist cintura in Spanish, and wiggling around and seeing how the other person is responding. Then again, I think Nelly is a very good person to ask about this, because I think Nelly turns this into a performance, and I think that is kind of like her personality. I would never be able to do this, that I'm like way too shy, but I know that Nelly kind of like prepares, and it's kind of like it's a rehearsed performance when she goes and meets somebody in person. So maybe she would be a very good person to ask.
Nice, thank you.
Okay. Should we write? Do you think? Do you think you wanna? I have a template, and I can share it with you, and you can kind of like change. I mean, it's not. It's a very simple email, and I wanted it to be a simple one. But because I think we should all send an email today. I mean it, or a LinkedIn message, or a Facebook message. Um, do I was going to ask like, do you want to do that? But I think we should do it. I am gonna share this document on the comments. Oh wait, I'm gonna check if I can. There you go. So you can edit. So it's a Google Docs. At the end is kind of like the an email that has worked is for one of the conspiracy theorists. If you want, there might be. I mean, I'm not an English speaker, so maybe you find better ways of writing that. But should we come back, like take 4 minutes or 5 minutes and come back with something written, do you think that's enough time? It should be. Naomi saying like,
yeah, I think we should try it.
we should try it. Yeah,
Okay.
cool. Let's do until 15:55. 4 minutes, 5. I'll say here if you have questions. Cool. Are you, you're concentrated?
Okay, we have 5 minutes.
Yes, so I would suggest, does anybody feel like sharing and sending all together, and we can clap you and encourage everyone else to do it, please? It doesn't need to be perfect.
Yeah.
We can figure it out together, but let's do it together. I think it's like, it makes a huge difference. My writing buddy was Ryan Ackholt, who you met in the meeting. We would sit together and kind of like take each other through it.
Okay, a volunteer, or I will act as a random selector.
Cool.
Okay. No volunteers, random selector is Teresa.
Okay, so well, I'm in the space where I am still figuring out my project, and I've been researching really last few days about superstring theory, and I've been looking at loads of emails. So basically, this exercise, I just went to start write an email to this guy who did lots of TED Talks about superstring theory, and I don't know what do you want me to do, Male? You are muted.
Okay.
Mala, you're muted.
Ah, sorry. Do you want to read the email that you drafted for him?
Okay, I just started. Oh, I was redoing yours, and I was just saying, dear Brian, hope this email finds you well. My name is Teresa Chervenova. I'm an artistic researcher, and then the thing about the University of the Underground, and literally, I have found your contact details on your website after watching many of the videos in which you are passionately sharing the mysteries of superstring theory. As I'm currently working on a project that requires me to apply independent scientific method, I want to politically inquire about the relationship between spirituality and science with my lens focused on the string theory. I'm a photographer, that's where I got to so far.
Cool. So I would eliminate, I would join the part of scientific, independent scientific thing. I would kind of just erase that bit and just say I am currently working on a project with a focus on blah blah blah. I think that was super clear, because that's independent scientific is kind of scientific revisionists. So basically, people who kind of say physics are not right. So I don't think that's what you want to say. And then I would just kind of go into saying I tend to be quite apologetic on my emails, but I know that is something that women should stop doing. So I can tell you to stop doing it. I clearly cannot tell myself. So I tend to go, I appreciate you might be very busy, but you can just say, are you free for a chat? And I think that's kind of I think it's good because what do you want from him?
I mean, seriously, I was put on the spot because I'm definitely in that sphere which you were talking I have to figure out first what I'm doing, and I think that the main thing is that because it might not even be him, I just chose him literally because I was looking at a YouTube video earlier about that he spoke, but I think that what I want is he spoke from a very scientific perspective. What I'm interested in is that where that emerges with the unspeakable, the non-scientific, that's the spiritual. So I don't know, what would
I think you can say that. I think you can say I am in the process of figuring out what direction my project is going to take, and you seem to know a lot about this topic. I would find your input incredibly valuable, and I would love to have a chat with you. And then I think then you plan for when you have the chat with him to kind of ask very concrete questions about where he gets his information from, or if there is anybody else who has already been doing what you're doing. But I think it's totally fine, and that's for everyone to say I am in the process of figuring this out, and that's why I'm reaching out to you. That you know more than I do. And I think in Spanish we have this expression that I don't know how to say in English, maybe you can help me, but it's dorar la píldora. Do you know that one? It's when you make somebody feel very good about themselves. So you say all of these little things that are going to make them feel oh, I'm the coolest guy ever. And I think there's a little bit about that in kind of every time you reach out to someone. Does it make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Teresa, write it and we'll send it together. You can do it. Come on. Just super quickly. I am in the process of figuring out the direction or something like that. And I would really appreciate your advice or help. Well, Teresa does that. I am super wary of time, but do you have a couple more minutes now?
I think Ada, our next lecturer, is already here.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, what can we do? Malena, would you be open to, like, if the participants send you like individual questions, would you be okay to have a look at their emails and their drafting?
Absolutely, but maybe would you mind creating a Google Docs and you put your emails there so I don't get like emails?
Yeah. Okay. So exactly.
And then we can do notes and then we'll celebrate next time. I think I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time anyways to do the same thing, to put you on the spot and force you to send emails.
Yeah.
It didn't work today. You will.
Fantastic. So let's do that.
Thank
you
you,
can come
Malena.
up with a Google Doc in the chat and then we share it with Malena.
You can put it in the one that I sent.
Okay.
Put everything there.
Okay, excellent.
Bye everyone. Thank you so much.